Hello, and thanks for being here for another English 101 video. In this video, we're going to be talking about a sample annotation, just like it says here. Hopefully, this is going to help you develop a good understanding of what goes in the annotations. Before we go any further, though, please do be sure that you have reviewed all the other content that leads up to this, particularly the directions and this Prezi, right? Because as I talk about what goes in the different parts of the sample annotation, that's going to make a lot more sense if you've already read this, because the whole idea here is that when you sit down and you go to do the homework and you try to create an annotation for the source that I'm actually just going to give you, that you'll have a better idea of how to do that by looking at an example from another student who's done it quite well, right? So let's go ahead and get into this. Again, these are the things that we're looking for in that student's document, right? Citation, the note of authority, the summary of the source, the explanation of how it will be used. Those are the components of the entries in the annotated bibliography. You will do this for 5 different sources. Let's go ahead and look at the sample. All right. Let's just take a look at the page here. Now, I left the working thesis part blank because you don't need to worry about that yet. It's just the first week. Most students will not have that strong of an opinion about the topic before they start the research. Honestly, your research will go better if you don't have a strong opinion going in. That's part of the reason that I choose the topics instead of allowing students to self-select them. Now, by next week, you should be starting to think about your working thesis, right? Which is, where do you stand on this question of whether the government should tax sugar? Or where do you stand on this question of whether we need to have more government regulation on e-cigarettes? That's the working thesis, right? You know what a thesis is. You had one in the op-ed. A working thesis, that just implies that it might change, right? Because the idea is that the working thesis, this is the argument you're going to make in the final paper. It's the argument you're going to make in the position paper, right? And then these are all the sources that you're going to use to help create that argument, right? And so then the annotated bibliography is, of course, you're saying, here's the argument I'm going to make. Here's all the sources that I'm going to use to help me make it. And then I'm going to give you feedback on whether you've chosen credible sources and whether you understand them well enough to enter into the final paper. Because as you see, when we're going to talk about the summaries, you have to know the sources well to write them. Because as you can see, I don't want to forget to say this later, there's no quoted material in here. These are all the student's words. The student understands the source quite well, and so the student was able to write about it in their own words. Do not put quoted material in the annotations. Do not copy material from the source without using quotes. That's worse, right? That's plagiarism. You have to be able to write about the source in your own words. And some students don't like that because it's challenging. You have to read the source multiple times and really understand it. But let me tell you, if you can do that, you'll do well on that final paper of the semester. And that's what we want, right? Because it's worth a lot of points. It is in lieu of a final exam. More on the position paper another day. Okay, so let's get into looking at the different components of the sample entry in the annotated bibliography. Here's the first part. That's the citation. You knew that, right? Of course, we've talked a great deal about how and where to get this information, but it's neat. If you use the library to find the source, the library will give you the citation. There's a video embedded in the homework directions that will show you how to do that. Please note that the citation has a hanging indent, like all citations do. And so be sure that if you don't know how to do that yet, you should by now, because we've done 2 papers with this. But if you don't, navigate over to the Help with Citation module so that you can see how to do this. And then as you can see, when you write your annotation, just tab it over so it lines up real neatly like that. That's exactly what yours should look like. So there is the citation. What's next? The note on authority. Your explanation to me of why this source is credible. Why is this source credible enough to use in this paper? Well, it's an explanation of the authors, right? And so, look, sometimes you're going to have a source that has multiple authors, and the best approach, if there's 3 or 4 or 5 authors, is to do what the student did here, which is to just give us some information about the lead author that explains what makes that person credible. What would have been nice, and again, this is a sample, it's an A paper, but it's not perfect. What would have been nice would be to do maybe one sentence about the lead author and then one sentence about the periodical in which it is found, which in this case is an academic journal, the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine. You can see I italicized it because the student neglected to do that in the citation. Again, it's not perfect, right? That's the point of, that's the only challenge of using student samples. However, I do think that it should be encouraging to you that I'm not making these up myself, right? They're from students, and so they're not perfect, but they're pretty darn good, and they're students just like you in my English 101 class. Anyhow, here is our note on authority for why we should trust Matthew Dew. It's quite good. Again, I do think they could have told us a little bit about what is the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine. Any periodical that you see that you find is going to have an about page. You just, go to the home page for the journal or the New York Post or whatever periodical it is that you're looking at the Wall Street Journal. They've got an about page that will tell you about why they're credible, and then you can put some of that information in there in addition to information on the author. So that's the note on authority. What's next? Well, let's look. Next is the summary of the source. So let's go ahead and get into that. So all of this is facts from the article. All right, so this is the student explaining some of the contents of this article to me. It is all in the student's own words. These are not direct quotes from the source. This is what's called paraphrase, right? There was a reading about paraphrase when we did the op-ed. That's when you summarize the author's point in your own words. It's an important component of academic writing. You have to get good at it to be successful at academic writing. You cannot just rely on quotes alone, right? And so this is what I'm looking for here. Now, of course, if you were to go and look at this, you'd see it's quite a long article. It's pretty dense. The student is just giving me the high points, showing me the parts of it that the student is most interested in, that they are potentially going to use in that final paper of the semester, the position paper, right? I mean, because when you look at this, it's not insanely long, right? I mean, if you think about the word count, you need about 150 words for each source to reach at least 750 for the annotated bibliography. Of course, I would encourage you to write more than that. Generally, the bigger the summaries, the better you know the source. But I don't think you need to turn in an 1,100-word paper to get an A paper. The summaries should be succinct and clear like this one. So that's the summary of the source. If it was an opinionated source, it would be a summary of the source's argument. If you want to look at one like an example of that, go to the Prezi that talks about, under the module, that talks about how to create an annotated bibliography. And it shows you a sample annotation for Rowe, just because that's an article that we've all read, right? You remember Rowe from the solitary confinement paper. And his summary, it's a summary of his argument, right? So if you want to see an example of that, then you can check out that Prezi. What is left? The explanation of how the source will be used. Remember, you're not making an argument in the annotated bibliography. This is all informational writing. Instead, you're thinking about what argument do you want to make in the final paper, right? And these sources are going to help you make it. So here's why we can trust them. Here's what they say, the summary. So what's left? The note on use. What are you going to do with it? Why did you choose this source and not another one? Right? And again, don't just say, this is an informational source. It will help me provide my reader with information. Okay, that's not helpful to you, and it's not helpful to me, and it's going to lose points, right? I mean, the whole point, well, not the whole point, but one of the points of this assignment is for you to help plan ahead and think about, what is that last paper going to look like? Why is this relevant? How might I use this to help make my argument? Is this facts to help them understand the topic in general, or is this something here that I can use that's persuasive, right? And so you can see that the student has done some thinking about that, right? And the student says, aha, there are facts here that support my claim that the government needs to step in because of the similarities, according to some authors, in terms of public health concerns between sugar-sweetened beverages and other things that are already taxed by the government, right? I do think the student probably could have had a little bit more detail in the note on use, but did you notice they didn't just say it supports their claim? They did identify some of the interesting facts from the article that they'd like to focus on, which is this idea of warning labels. Anyhow, so this is not a perfect entry, but it's pretty good, right? And so the idea is that looking at this hopefully is going to give you a better idea of what your finished annotated bibliography should look like. Right? You do all these steps 5 times total, right? And so, look, you can go ahead, start clicking forward, and then you'll see at the end of this week, you are going to create your first annotation. I'm going to go ahead and give you a source for that, right? Your other 4 sources you'll need to find on your own, right? We'll talk about how to do that next week, talk about how to find credible sources. But for right now, let's make sure you've got this annotation thing down, right? Because if you understand it and you can do it really well, then really the big challenge going forward is just to find the sources and read them thoroughly. If you understand how to do the annotations, right, then that's all that's left. That's about all I've got. As usual, if you have questions, message me in Canvas or maybe stop by virtual office hours. Take care of yourself and have a good one.